The milieu of American independent film directors who in the 1940s devoted works to the exploration and visualization of the psychological, the surreal, and the occult dimension was a breath of fresh air for those who saw cinema as a form of art rather than a mass product serialized by Hollywood majors. Europe had already developed a distinctive cinematic style of its own through the influence of artistic movements such as Tristan Tzara's Dadaism and André Breton's Surrealism. Films like Un Chant Andalou by Salvatore Dali and Louis Buñuel or René Clair's Entr'acte provided the basic recipe for what has been termed avant-garde or experimental cinema. Rapid editing, the absence of a linear plot, dream-like sequences, new ways of treating the film itself by adapting paint on it or scratching it, for example. When Meshes of the Afternoon, directed by pioneer Maya Deren and the husband Alexander Hamid, was produced in the United States, and we're talking about 1943, a new wave of enthusiastic young independent directors followed suit. One of the most prominent members of this avant-garde group was Kenneth Anger, better known by his nom de guerre, Kenneth Anger. Anger's main occult influences before 1945 had been French occultist Eliphas Levi and Sir James Frazer, author of The Golden Bough. It may be a mere coincidence that Crowley had a huge respect both for Levi, considering himself to be his reincarnation. Levi died in 1875 and Crowley was born in 1875, so quite a seminal year in the history of occultism. And obviously Frazer, who he quotes many times in his magical works. It was the discovery of the works of English occultist and ceremonial magician Aleister Crowley himself, though, that would change the focus of Anger's art forever. The presentation will be divided in two sections. In the first, I will strive to highlight the most evident aspects of Crowleyan philosophy and symbology within the films in which such influence is most evident, namely Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, Invocation of My Demon Brother, and Lucifer Rising. The presence of fireworks is very important, and we'll come to that in a bit. In the second, I will analyze Anger as a Crowleyan magus, who uses the medium of cinema to alter the consciousness of his audience, thus effectively working magic and not merely being influenced by it. The most immediate presence of Crowley in Anger's films, and the most noticeable, even to those completely new to Thelemic imagery, is the imminent presence of pictures and stills of the great beast himself. An elderly man presiding over the lighting of the Luciferian flame in Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, or a framed icon witnessing the first steps of the newly risen Lucifer Horus. In Lucifer Rising, in Invocation, the bond between Crowley and Anger is even stronger, and still is shown of the director and one of the Magus' most successful novels, Moonchild, of 1917, at his feet. Indeed, it might be argued, at least I argue, and with reason, that Moonchild's plot, namely the physical manifestation of an ethereal being by magical means, influenced the very narrative devices present in Invocation. The plots and various themes of the films are visual renditions of rituals or concepts committed to writing by the British occultists. Inauguration, in the director's own words, quote, is derived from one of Crowley's dramatic rituals where people assume the identity of a god or a goddess. The main characters are the Great Beast and the Scarlet Woman, figures taken from the Book of Revelation, central to the philosophy of Thelema, with whom Crowley identified himself and his partner in the practice of sex magic. It is interesting to note that the role of the Scarlet Woman in the film itself is played by Marjorie Cameron, Anger's friend, but most importantly, former member of Californian Agape Lodge of the Ordo Templi Orientis, order which Crowley led from 1922 to 1947 when he died. Cameron had also been wife to JPL scientist and Thelemic practitioner John Whiteside Parsons, so that is another curious link to the Thelemic world between Anger and Crowley. Lucifer Rising has been seen by critic Anna Powell to be a cinematographic rendition of the concepts expounded on in Liberal, the text Crowley claimed to have received from a proto-human intelligence named Iwas in 1904 in Cairo. The three main figures in Liberal, Nuit, Hadith, and Rahukuit, are cast by Anger as Isis, Osiris, and Lucifer Horus. It is the clash between the opposites in this film, the conjuncture oppositorum represented by the close montages of images of fire and water, of light and darkness, that herald the new Aeon. Just as in the Book of the Law, the second chapter describes the turbulence of coming times under the law of the strong, chapter 2:21. The use of Lucifer as Horus, both in invocation and Luciferizing, can be seen in part by Anger's fascination with Crowley's poem, Hymn to Lucifer. Its last verse, the key of joy is disobedience, suggesting the realization of humankind's godlike capacities denied by Christianity. Another obvious Crowleyan influence is the heavy use of occult symbology. An intermittently flashing unicursal hexagram is employed in invocation as a way of framing the rituals depicted on film in a Thelemic environment. As verbal communication is totally absent from Anger's works, images also need to convey messages, which in a traditional ceremonial ritual would be left to speech. Therefore, inserts and superimpositions are frequent, and many of them allude to Crowley, like his personal lamen appearing in Inauguration. You can see that on the left, below some other scenes. I mean, these are just flashing, as you will see later in the real film, so catching a clean shot of them is pretty difficult. The symbols of the Ordo Templi Orientis and the Astrum Argentum, flashing in invocation, and that's on the picture on the right. In his Liber Agape, Crowley writes on the topic of sex and magic, quote, "For this is the arcanum of the Hierophants of old, that in the cult of the sun in heaven and of the phallus on earth, all men can unite." End of quote. This, as Anger biographer Bill Landis writes, is the solar phallic religion that Anger has personally and publicly worshipped throughout his life. At the end of the 19th century, a plethora of publications dealing with the subject of phallicism, old and new, had captivated the imagination of part of English Victorian society, with its most popular authors being classical scholar and antiquarian Richard Payne Knight, and Freemason and amateur historian of religions Hargrave Jennings. The works of such authors with tantalizing titles such as The Worship of Priapus and Phallicism, Celestial and Terrestrial, Heathen and Christian, and Phallic Miscellanies, Facts and Phases of Ancient and Modern Sex Worship, put forth the theory that all religion derived from an ancient form of phallic worship of the sun and of fire. Such ideas appealed greatly to Crowley, and as Richard Kaczynski has attested in his paper, Continuing Knowledge from Generation unto Generation, many of such themes were eagerly embraced by Crowley and adapted to his philosophy, as can be evidenced by the thinly veiled symbolism present in his Book 15, also known as the Gnostic Mass, composed in 1913. References to the phallus in Anger's works are really too many to mention in such a small time frame. But the most obvious that spring to mind are the ones brandished by different actors in all three of the movies. Here we see the figure of the albino in Invocation of My Demon Brother, but himself as Amagus always has a wand in his hand and is brandishing it. Apart from that, we have Lord Shiva in Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome with his elongated headdress, and the Egyptian colonnades filmed in Lucifer Rising. To avoid the crudeness of filming sexual intercourse and the consumption of the amrita, the mixed bodily fluids, which represent the culmination of the sexual magical practice, Anger emphasized the concept of Eucharist, on which Crowley had written in Magic and Theory and Practice. Quote, "Take a substance, symbolic of the whole course of nature, make it God, and consume it," unquote. And again, quote, "A Eucharist of some sort should most assuredly be consumed daily by every magician. The magician becomes filled with God, fed upon God, intoxicated with God." It is no surprise that Fraser's Golden Bough has references to the idea of eating the god, and that's probably where he got this idea. It is in this light that we must see the Scarlet Woman lighting the cigar-sized joint at the beginning of Inauguration, the passing round of the skull-shaped pipe in Invocation, and most of all, the orgy among gods ensuing after the libation from the cup in which Lord Shiva had secretly dropped a non-specified powder. In the Book of the Law, Rahokut advises thus, quote, "To worship me, take wine and strange drugs, whereof I will tell my prophet." It is divine intoxication that Anger hints to, not some free and careless drug abuse. The Crowleyan influence in Anger's films is multi-layered and at times more subtle than is commonly thought. As film critic Tony Raines wrote, quote, "I'm not saying that the movies are esoteric mysteries, although some do argue with him, impenetrable to non-followers of Crowley's line, but simply that the viewer who comes to them with some awareness of what magic is all about will have a sharper understanding of why Anger made them the way he did." End of quote. Psychoanalyst and film critic Mikita Brotman has argued that, quote, "The filmmaker is an artist working in light, his camera a ceremonial instrument of invocation, the cinematograph his magical scepter, and the Lord of Light, of course, is Lucifer." End of quote. Anger can definitely be categorized as a magician of light. In every film in which he appears, his figure is never that of the director. It is always that of the spell weaver. In Inauguration, he is, strangely enough, Hecate, a female goddess of magic par excellence, while in Invocation and Lucifer Rising, he represents the quintessential ceremonial magician, decked in swirling robes and brandishing wands and arcane symbols. It has been argued by Anger himself that cinematic projection is in itself a magical ceremony. Quote, "The intention behind films like Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome was to open up the cinematic experience to new levels of consciousness, not ordinarily attained during normal life. The esoteric nature of these films is designed to help the audience attain an altered state of mind." End of quote. Anger has proved to be a source of inspiration for many filmmakers and artists in general, because of his distinct qualities and because of his works. In 1989, out of all the directors one could think of, director Martin Scorsese claimed, open quote, "There is a pagan religiosity in his films. His continuous reference to myth and ritual creates a hypnotizing, a dream atmosphere that puts the viewer in a state of trance. Kenneth Anger is a unique filmmaker, an artist of exceptional talents." End quote. Far from wanting to comment on the judgment of such a maestro of cinema, we must nevertheless ask ourselves, is Anger only a filmmaker, albeit a brilliant one? Avant-garde film critic P. Adam Sipney has suggested that Anger's work offers both religious revelation and the dynamics of imaginary initiation for both characters and the spectators. Anger, circumambulating round the sacred circle, his raising of energy, is designed to excite the psyche of the viewer, altering his sense of perception and communicating through images in a powerful, non-verbal fashion. As may be expected in some cases, the use of drugs while viewing the screenings was actively encouraged. When the 1965 version of Inauguration, known as the Sacred Mushroom Edition, was released, the program offered brief intermissions in the form of notes to the public. The first note recited, quote, "Note, psychedelic researchers desirous to turn on for Pleasure Dome should absorb the sugar cubes at this point," end of quote. The second one went, "Note, psychedelic researchers preparing for Pleasure Dome should remain seated during this intermission. The following film should, under ideal circumstances, be experimented in that holy trance called high," end of quote. Similarly, in 1966, Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome enjoyed a psychedelic revival at the movie, a San Francisco art house, at the acid test program, with ads exhorting patrons to, quote, "drop your acid and see the movie." In 1910, at Caxton Hall in London, Aleister Crowley, a pioneer in many different facets of arts, as we've seen, had staged his Rites of Eleusis, and he too tried to induce an altered state of consciousness by blurring the distinction between the actors and the viewers. Concerning this experiment, theatrical critic Tracy Tupman writes, quote, "To include the audience as part of the production, serves to illustrate one of the first attempts in the 20th century to consciously create a psychological connection between theatrical and religious practice, end of quote. The rites featured a main performing trio formed by poet-reciter Aleister Crowley, dancer Victor Neuberg, and solo violinist Leila Waddell. A libation seems to have been passed around, possibly containing a mild hallucinogenic substance in order to induce what Crowley defined as ecstasy, as we can tell from an article from The Looking Glass, then king of yellow journalism, so gossip and scandals, commenting on an uncomfortable audience, most of whom were perched on small wooden stools at a foot from the floor. That must have been quite uncomfortable. I quote from this article. Mr. Crowley says that the end and aim of his rites is ecstasy. Somebody ought to tell him that ecstasy of any kind is impossible when your foot has gone to sleep. Just like Crowley before him, Anger recognizes his role as a torchbearer of the new Aeon. As a director and magus, he feels it his duty to proclaim the tenets of the new age, heralded by the reception of the Book of the Law. Lucifer rising, so, can be seen as a representation of the death of the Aeon of Osiris and the celebration of the fall of Judeo-Christian values. As Anger himself argued, quote, the last 2,000 years were based on renunciation, sacrifice, and guilt. The fight for the next generation, the next 25 years, 50 years, just the beginning of the fight really, is skinning off the shell that's left over from the last era, end of quote. In the role of magus, Anger makes ample use of what he defines as sigil magic. The modern usage of sigils in Western magic was repopularized by artist Austin Osman Clare, for a short time a follower of Crowley and the author of some of the most beautiful and haunting paintings of occult art of the early part of the 20th century. Referring to Anger, Carol Rowe has written, quote, he sees glyphs, hieroglyphs, sigils, pictographs, billboards, and especially tattoos as magical marks on the wall, end of quote. To consecrate these sigils, while more conventional magicians use their willpower, water, visualization, or the smearing of bodily fluids upon them, Anger uses special effects and colours. The magical tattoos in Invocation, the triangular figure referring to the higher Sephiroth of the Tree of Life, seen at the opening of the film. Every detail, which to an untrained eye seems like an innocuous extravagance, becomes of paramount importance if we want to understand Anger qua magus. Lighting and intense colouring of the scenes can be analysed by cross-referencing Kabbalistic correspondences, 777. Red is the dominant colour of the martial chaos of Invocation, where Anger strides across the stage, bearing a swastika flag and angrily utilising every drop of energy in the ritual. Can't get more pissed off than that, wearing a swastika flag and running around. And the illuminated spirit in Inauguration, which is on the right, basks in the golden light of Tifereth. Colours, food, drugs, jewels, every element in Anger's films follows this hermetic scales of correspondences. Yet, just as Crowley had enhanced the table of correspondences which he had inherited from Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mather's Golden Dawn system, Anger expands 777 lists with visual elements. By including homoeroticism, youth culture, fashions, countercultural stars, pop music, and ironical humour, he extends Crowley's system, increasing its relevance for contemporary culture. The chaos and vitality brought forth by the Aeon of Horus are represented by featuring parodies of rebelliousness and exuberance, immediately accessible to the potential viewer. Thus in Invocation, the liveliness of the hippies is contrasted with the fierceness of the Hells Angels, and the scene of soldiers landing in Vietnam, continuously repeated throughout the film at a subliminal level, is another example. The tranquility of Anais Nin playing Astarte contrasts sharply with the devilish figure of Manson family member Bobby Beausoleil. Chapter 2, verse 20 of the Book of the Law enunciates the most characteristic traits that pertain to the man of the new Aeon. Quote, "Beauty and strength, leaping laughter and delicious languor, force and fire are of us." The us referring to the men of the new Aeon. Anger's works possess all of these qualities, and most of the characters in his films display these features. There is little time for me to explore the similarities between the lives of Crowley and Anger, but one essential point has to be discussed. That of the use of sexuality as a means to attaining higher states of consciousness. Those familiar with the biography of the British Magus need only watch Fireworks of 1947 and Scorpio Rising of 1963 to appreciate the same homoerotic tension that can be gleaned from some of Crowley's turbulent relationships with men. H.C.G. Pollitt and Victor Neuburg come to mind. And his early literary outputs, such as White Stains and the Bagi Muata, The Scented Garden of Abdullah of 1910, are another example. As Paul A. Drockton rightly underlines, quote, "Anger has been described as one of America's openly gay filmmakers, and certainly the first whose work addressed homosexuality in an undisguised, self-implicating matter." End of quote. In fact, Anger, in very early stages of his life, was actually beaten up for being a homosexual. Hence, his usage of homosexual imagery was probably even more pronounced after that happened, as a retaliation. Furthermore, we must consider that films like Fireworks and Scorpio Rising were shot and released before homosexuality became legal in the United States. Just as Crowley's homoerotic poetry was often printed abroad to avoid the prudish intervention of Victorian censorship. Indeed, both artists had their work destroyed when caught. 33 copies of the Bagi Muata were confiscated in 1924 and subsequently destroyed by His Majesty's Customs, while Anger's work, The Love That Whirls of 1949, was destroyed by the technicians at the Film Lab, who deemed it too obscene for public screening, or even private for that matter. Raines has likened Anger's oldest excellent film, Fireworks, as a cinematic adaptation of Crowley's Liber Pyramidos, a self-initiation ritual which sees the ritual magician cast forth from darkness into the light of initiatory knowledge. That Anger had access to Liber Pyramidos at the age of 20 in 1947 seems quite unlikely. Nevertheless, there seems to be a link between the violence, both psychological and physical, that Anger the actor has to suffer before finally lying in bed with a sailor. And sections of Crowley's ritual in which the Magus uses the scourge on his buttocks, cuts across with a dagger upon his chest and tightens the chain of the bell around his forehead, all suggest a somewhat similar process from pain to initiation. As a Crowley scholar, and thus more knowledgeable of the esoteric rather than cinematic side of the matter, I propose another way to link Fireworks to Crowley's work and life, which in my opinion is even more efficient than that proposed by Raines. The analysis of his stay in the Swedish city of Stockholm for New Year's Eve 1894, and the occurrence of the British Magus's first mystical experience. As Tobias Churton, Crowley biographer, all too clearly tells us about this experience. Quote, "The suggestion is one of having awakened to the magical power of will, a kind of Damascus Road, life-changing experience. It was, but Crowley's Damascus Road was a path to his bottom. Painful to begin with, but in the end, ecstatic. And in my opinion, that is exactly what Fireworks is. A mystical awakening, painful to begin with, but in the end, ecstatic." The artistic career also seems to follow parallel lines, the two artists often being relegated beyond the limelight. To both, the underground distribution of their artistic outputs was never a matter of choice, but of necessity. As Crowley often sought a contract from more prestigious publishing companies, Anger's exclusion from Hollywood sets is dictated by the lack of approval his favorite themes have for a widespread audience. In his own words, quote, "I'd be a willing capitalist slave to Jack Warner of Warner Bros. Fame to this day, if they wanted it, the way lots of artists worked for Lorenzo de' Medici just for bread and butter," end of quote. To conclude, it is useful to quote film critic John P. Bradburn when he talks about occult cinema and Anger, Harry Smith and William Burroughs. And I quote, "These artists took cinema as a ritual, Cinema as a process to create effect. Much of what Godard said about political cinema can be said for occult cinema. It is not cinema of the occult, but cinema made in an occult way. Ritualistic, exploratory, experimental, and attempting mystical revelations, end of quote. But with Anger, all of these ideas come with an extra Thelemic twist. As the director has stated in an interview, quote, "I have one product that I am selling, the 20th century most misunderstood genius called Aleister Crowley," end of quote. It is my firm opinion that Crowley's influence on Kenneth Anger transcends the stylistic and aesthetic element. In Anger, we recognize a magus of the new Aeon and a practitioner of light magic who evokes Crowleyan fantasies to visually usher the spectator into the new Aeon of Horus. Thank you very much.